The moment an empire appears strongest is often the moment it is already beginning to die. Rome stationed hundreds of thousands of soldiers across thousands of kilometers of frontier. Spain extracted over 1 million kilograms of silver from the New World. The Ottoman Empire commanded the richest trade routes on earth. Each looked invincible. Each collapsed the same way, not from sudden catastrophe, but because the cost of holding power quietly outpaced the economic strength that built it. There is a name for this pattern, and a formula that predicts exactly when decline becomes irreversible. Empires don't collapse because they lose a single battle or face a sudden disaster. The real breaking point comes from a structural gap, a mismatch between what an empire tries to control and what its economy can actually support. Historians Paul Kennedy and John Brewer describe this as imperial overstretch. It's not just about how far armies can march or how many ships can cross the seas. The real limit is economic. The moment a state's commitments, its armies, its borders, its bureaucracy, cost more than the nation's tax base and productive capacity can sustain. This gap can be measured. Imagine a simple formula. Take the total cost of military forces, add the price of maintaining distant provinces and the salaries of officials, and compare that to all the money the state collects in taxes, trade, and tribute. When the cost side grows faster than the revenue side, the empire faces a choice: raise taxes, borrow money, or debase the currency. Each option brings its own problems. Higher taxes spark unrest. Borrowing piles up debt and interest. Debasement, reducing the silver or gold content in coins, fuels inflation. Over time, this war, tax, and debt spiral tightens. Military spending eats up more of the budget, and interest payments on old loans crowd out spending on everything else. Corruption and mismanagement often spread as officials scramble to cover shortfalls or enrich themselves before the system collapses. Political instability follows as rival factions fight over shrinking resources. The warning signs are visible long before the final crisis: rising military costs, soaring government debt, currency losing value, and a growing sense that the empire's ambitions are out of step with its real strength. Economic limits, not battlefield defeats, are what bring even the mightiest empires to their knees. Ledgers, coin hoards, and shipping manifests reveal the hidden mechanics of imperial collapse. These records, left behind by tax collectors, army paymasters, and customs officials, capture the flow of money, goods, and obligations that held vast empires together. By tracing the numbers in these documents, how much silver filled the treasury, how many soldiers drew pay, what taxes came in, and what debts piled up, we can reconstruct not only the scale of an empire's ambition, but the limits of what its economy could bear. The methodology is simple but rigorous. For each empire, the most direct evidence comes first. Primary documents like tax registers, coinage series, and official budgets. These sources stand above anecdote or legend. They show, year by year, how the state's resources matched up against its military and administrative burdens. Alongside these ledgers, institutional records, such as army muster rolls or customs receipts, add another layer, revealing how resources were allocated and where shortfalls began to appear. Quantitative anchors, like the percentage of revenue spent on the military or the rate of coin debasement, provide hard benchmarks for comparison across cases. Each case study, Rome, Spain, and the Ottoman Empire, will center on one set of numbers that captures the breaking point. The fiscal squeeze in Rome's tax edicts and debased coins, Spain's royal debt ledgers and silver inflows, and the Ottoman payrolls and tax farm contracts. These will be paired with the stories of institutions, how armies, treasuries, and bureaucracies adapted or failed as the gap between ambition and income grew. This approach grounds the narrative in evidence, allowing patterns and warning signs to emerge from the data itself, not from speculation. Roman power stretched from the windswept moors of Britain to the deserts of Syria, guarded by a defensive line that ran more than 5,500 kilometers. Along these borders, the empire kept a standing army that, by the early 5th century, reached nearly 400,000 professional soldiers, with some estimates climbing to 600,000 when auxiliary and militia units are included. The Notitia Dignitatum, a late imperial roster, catalogs this vast deployment. Legions and limitanae were posted every 10 to 15 kilometers, and each outpost demanded food, pay, and supplies that had to be hauled over mountains and rivers. The cost of this military apparatus outpaced anything the Roman treasury had managed before. Grain doles to the cities, fortification projects like the Aurelian Walls, and the salaries of an ever-expanding bureaucracy all competed for revenue. The tax base, once broad and reliable, began to erode as wars, plague, and rural decline hollowed out the provinces. To keep the system afloat, emperors turned to the mint. The Antoninianus, introduced in the 3rd century, started with about 50% silver content. But as the crisis deepened, each new issue contained less precious metal. By the time of Gallienus, the coin held barely 5% silver, and under Aurelian, it dropped to just 2%. Prices soared, confidence plummeted, and the value of savings evaporated almost overnight. Diocletian, rising from the ranks of the military, tried to halt the spiral. His reforms reorganized the empire into 4 administrative regions, hoping to make tax collection and defense more manageable. He issued the Edict on Maximum Prices in 301 CE, an attempt to freeze inflation by setting ceilings on hundreds of goods and services. At the same time, he overhauled the tax system, introducing the capitatio and eugatio, which tried to match tax obligations to the number of people and the productivity of the land. But these measures could not reverse the underlying problem. The empire's commitments, from soldiers' pay to frontier maintenance, kept growing faster than its ability to raise revenue. The numbers tell the story. By the late 3rd century, military spending consumed more than a quarter of state revenue, and the cost of the grain annona rivaled the entire defense budget. The silver content of coins had dropped more than tenfold in a single generation. Each reform brought only a brief respite before new shortfalls appeared. Diocletian's efforts, though ambitious, could not close the gap between the empire's ambitions and its shrinking economic base. The fiscal strain was not an abstract problem. It was measured in unpaid soldiers, abandoned outposts, and a currency no one trusted. Rome's decline began not with a single defeat, but with the slow, relentless arithmetic of imperial overstretch. Galleons loaded with silver left the Americas for Seville year after year. Between 1500 and 1650, nearly 1.2 million kilograms of New World silver flooded into Spain's treasury. The ledgers at the Casa de Contratación show a windfall so immense it seemed to promise endless riches. But the numbers on the page told a different story. Instead of building a stable foundation, the crown funneled this bullion into a sprawling web of wars: the Dutch revolt, the defense of Italy, and the struggle to keep the Habsburg dynasty's grip on Europe. Each campaign demanded more men, more ships, and more gold than the last. By the 1550s, annual shipments peaked at over 130,000 kilograms. The crown borrowed heavily against future arrivals, mortgaging silver that had not even left the mines. Genoese bankers and royal bondholders lined up to finance Spain's ambitions, charging steep interest for the privilege. Military payrolls and supply contracts ballooned, swallowing up tax revenue and bullion alike. The royal finance minister shuffling ledgers in Madrid faced an impossible arithmetic. Outflows always ran ahead of inflows. To keep armies in the field, the crown issued more juros, state bonds, at ever higher rates. Silver poured into Spain, but prices across Europe soared. The so-called price revolution saw the cost of grain, cloth, and tools rise by 150% between 1520 and 1600. Inflation eroded the value of wages and tax receipts, making it harder for the crown to meet its obligations. The silver that once paid for armies now barely covered interest on old debts. By 1557, the state defaulted, suspending payments to its creditors. The cycle repeated again in 1596, when Philip II declared a moratorium that sent shockwaves through European finance. At the time of the 1596 default, outstanding debt approached 2/3 of annual revenue, an impossible burden for even the world's richest monarchy. With each crisis, the crown turned to new taxes and desperate fiscal tricks. Customs duties on American silver rose. Corruption spread through the hacienda and the Casa de Contratación, as officials skimmed off shipments or sold tax farms to the highest bidder. The gap between the empire's ambitions and its economic base only widened. The warning signs, soaring military costs, repeated defaults, runaway inflation, and administrative decay were visible in every royal account book. By the time the silver fleets began to shrink and creditors demanded higher premiums, Spain's imperial power was already hollowed out from within. The bullion boom that once seemed to guarantee dominance had become a trap, pulling the empire toward insolvency and decline. Ottoman accountants in the late 17th century faced a new kind of arithmetic. The empire's customs houses along the Levant, once flush with trade from Asia and Africa, recorded a steady decline. Registers from the 1550s show annual customs receipts near 2 million AKC. By 1700, after the rise of Atlantic shipping and the diversion of Indian Ocean trade to European-controlled ports, those receipts had dropped by nearly 40%. The state's fiscal backbone, the revenue from taxing Silk Road caravans and Mediterranean grain, grew brittle as the world's trade routes shifted west. At the same time, the cost of maintaining the Janissary Corps, the empire's elite standing army, soared. Payroll records show the number of Janissaries swelling from 80,000 in the late 16th century to more than 120,000 by the mid-17th. The monthly stipend for each soldier more than doubled, and by 1650, Janissary pay alone consumed about 12% of total state revenue. The imperial treasury, once able to cover these costs from direct taxes and customs, now struggled to keep pace. To bridge the growing gap, Ottoman officials expanded the iltizam system, outsourcing tax collection to private contractors. These tax farm contracts, sold at auction, tripled in number between 1520 and 1700. The average value of a contract rose sharply, but so did the leakage. Local tax farmers, eager to maximize their own profits, often underreported receipts or bribed administrators to look the other way. The central government received less and less of each AKC collected in the provinces, while local magnates grew richer and more independent. The numbers tell a clear story. Customs revenues shrank by nearly half. The Janissary payroll ballooned, taking a larger share of a shrinking pie. The iltizam system, designed to provide quick cash, ended up eroding the state's control over its own finances. Unlike Rome or Spain, the Ottoman Empire did not lose vast territories overnight. Instead, its economic foundation was hollowed out by market shifts, rising payrolls, and the slow siphoning of revenue through tax farming. The imperial overstretch appeared not as a sudden collapse, but as a chronic weakening, measured in ledgers, contracts, and the quiet withdrawal of wealth from the center to the periphery. Every empire that reaches its peak faces the same dilemma, the temptation to expand just a bit further, to defend one more border, to rule one more province. But there is a repeating curve, a 5-stage sequence that shows how overstretch sets in and why collapse follows. The first stage is expansion. Here, the empire grows rapidly, fueled by victories, new territory, and economic windfalls. This is the era of confidence, when the state's resources seem limitless and the benefits of conquest are obvious. Tax revenues rise, armies swell, and the capital city becomes a showcase of imperial ambition. Stage 2 is saturation. The pace of expansion slows, not because of lack of will, but because the easiest gains are gone. New territories are harder to govern, and the cost of holding distant lands rises. The state now faces longer supply lines, more complex administration, and the first hints of strain in the treasury. Rome's reach into Britain, Spain's global armada, and the Ottoman push into Central Europe all show this pattern. The empire is still growing, but the returns are shrinking. Stage 3 is overstretch. Commitments outpace resources. Military spending climbs as the empire tries to defend its vast borders and suppress unrest. Tax increases, new loans, and currency debasement become routine tools to bridge the gap. But these measures bring side effects: unrest among taxpayers, rising interest payments, and inflation that eats away at savings. The warning signs multiply: unpaid soldiers, abandoned outposts, and officials who turn to bribery or graft to make up for shortfalls. Stage 4 is crisis. The fiscal gap becomes unmanageable. Defaults, mutinies, or regional revolts break out as the state struggles to pay its bills and keep order. Political factions turn on each other, blaming rivals for the crisis. In Rome, this meant a carousel of short-lived emperors. In Spain, repeated bankruptcies. In the Ottoman Empire, the rise of powerful local magnates and tax farmers who defied the center. The final stage is contraction or collapse. The empire loses control of outlying regions, either through rebellion, invasion, or negotiated retreat. The state's authority shrinks back to its core, often leaving behind fragmented provinces or rival claimants. What began as a story of unstoppable growth ends with a return to the limits set by economic reality. The curve is not just a story about ancient Rome or early modern Spain. It is a structural law, visible wherever power outgrows the resources that sustain it. 6 warning signs appear long before any empire collapses. These red flags can be tracked, measured, and debated, but they all point to the same underlying danger: the cost of power outpacing the resources that sustain it. First, watch for runaway military spending. When the share of state revenue devoted to defense climbs above historic norms, past 4 or 5% of GDP, or when armies and navies consume a third or more of the budget, history shows the strain becomes hard to reverse. Rome's legions, Spain's global fleets, and the Ottoman janissaries all pushed military costs to unsustainable levels in their final centuries. Second, mounting government debt. When states borrow to cover basic expenses year after year, interest payments begin to crowd out everything else. Spain's royal bonds, called juros, eventually required the crown to spend more on servicing old loans than on governing or defending its empire. Defaults followed, and with each one, borrowing became more expensive and less reliable. Third, repeated currency debasement or inflation. When the silver content of coins drops, or when paper money loses value, it is a sign the government cannot meet its bills from taxes alone. Rome's Antoninianus fell from 50% silver to less than 5% in a single generation. In Spain and the Ottoman Empire, inflation soared as real resources dwindled. Fourth, loss of key revenue streams. Empires that depend on a single source, like Spanish silver or Ottoman customs duties, are vulnerable when those streams dry up. The collapse of trade routes or the exhaustion of mines can trigger a sudden fiscal crisis. Fifth, corruption and administrative decay. When tax collection is outsourced, or when officials skim off revenue before it reaches the treasury, the state loses control over its own finances. The Ottoman iltizam system and Spain's sale of tax farms both hollowed out the fiscal core. Sixth, chronic economic stagnation. When growth falters, but spending commitments remain fixed or rising, the gap widens. Stagnant economies cannot support ambitious foreign policy or military buildup for long. These indicators rarely appear in isolation. They interact, feeding off each other and accelerating decline. Yet history also shows that collapse is not inevitable. Empires that recognize these warning signs early, reform their finances, and realign their ambitions can sometimes recover. But when leaders ignore the numbers or try to paper over deficits with more borrowing or monetary tricks, the end becomes a matter of time. The lesson is simple. Economic strength, not military might, is what sustains power in the long run. Every empire's reach eventually exceeds its grasp, not because of enemies at the gates, but because soaring costs and mounting debts erode the core from within. Today, global military spending has surpassed $2.2 trillion, and rising public debt tests the limits of modern states. The real fault line isn't strength, but sustainability. History asks, who will recognize the warning signs before it's too late? Share your thoughts below.